Hello everyone, Vivian Reed here to tell you about something extraordinary I discovered during the rather ordinary days of pandemic isolation. Today, I'd like to talk about coal and the roles of two extraordinary Americans who lent their expertise to ease tensions in Upper Silesia in 1919. They are Hugh Gibson and Anson Goodyear. Gibson became the first U.S. minister in Poland in 1919, an extraordinary appointment in several ways. At age 36, it was Gibson's first appointment at that level. Modern Poland had only been in existence for 5 months. Conditions were anything but ordinary. Gibson's wartime experience helped set the stage. As the German army invaded Belgium in August 1914, Gibson was on site at the U.S. legation. Harsh German rule threatened starvation for many Belgians as winter approached. A few Belgian officials invited Gibson to accompany them to London to seek aid in the face of the British naval blockade of Germany, which also cut off Belgian food imports. Herbert Hoover stepped in to head what became the Commission for Relief in Belgium. Gibson acted as diplomatic liaison between Hoover and the Belgian government until he was reposted to London in 1916, at the heart of the diplomatic intelligence sector. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Gibson was stationed in Washington, D.C. to attend to the foreign war missions of Britain, Belgium, and the Polish National Committee. In 1918, Gibson was reassigned to Paris. His wide variety of responsibilities included providing political and diplomatic advice to General John Pershing, coordinating military and diplomatic intelligence with General Dennis Nolan, and mitigating some of the gaffes of George Creel's Committee on Public Information. Soon after his arrival in Paris, Gibson ran into the shadowy figure of Jan Horodowski, whom he had met in Chicago during his work with the Polish war mission. Horodowski was a Pole from Galicia, who loosely served with British intelligence. Although Gibson approached Horodowski with a healthy skepticism, for some pretty good reasons, he also gleaned much valuable information from him about Polish concerns and a host of other matters of military and diplomatic interest. Allied victory was all but assured by the end of August 1918. Like many other nationalities across Europe, both the Poles and the Czechs saw a chance for independence and increased their lobby to Allied powers. The U.S. recognized both on September 26, 1918. Gibson was designated as the official liaison between both of them and the U.S. government. Gibson found the Czechs to be well organized and communicative. On the other hand, the Poles presented a more troublesome picture. Polish leadership was divided in both vision and aspirations, and actual information from within Polish territory was difficult to obtain. Eventually, Gibson received the information he requested and became aware of the enormity of the challenges facing the new proposed nation. November 11, 1918 brought the armistice, which halted the guns in Western Europe and created both Poland and Czechoslovakia. Gibson continued his work with both as the mad scramble to set up nations in war-torn territory began. He also assumed the role of diplomatic advisor to Hoover and the emerging American Relief Administration. Intelligence remained a large part of Gibson's work. He continued to collect and distribute information from some striking sources. One prime example is William Rose. Rose was a young YMCA secretary stationed near Prague in 1914. He spent the war years under Austrian rule in the Silesian countryside between Prague and Krakow. He lived the complicated social, economic, and political issues of the area. With no license to travel, Rose set out just before the armistice to offer the Allies first-hand information and seek their support for Poland. After a treacherous trip, Rose arrived in Paris and met with Gibson on November 17. Gibson found Rose to be full of just the kind of information he and his colleagues needed. Rose advocated for active Allied involvement in Poland and the immediate relocation of Haller's army to the contested territories, as well as much humanitarian aid as possible. Rose's information proved critical to American understanding of the situation in the disputed borderlands between Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. Armed with Rose's fresh intelligence, and mindful of his many tasks, Gibson set out on a whirlwind trip just before Christmas 1918 on the first American diplomatic mission to Central and Eastern Europe since 1914. Prague and Warsaw were his primary objectives. However, Vienna, with its displaced revolutionaries and endless intelligence opportunities, was the hub of Gibson's travel eastward. In Budapest, Gibson was the first American to visit Hungarian President Karolyi during the turbulent time of transition, and provides us with detailed analysis. For the purpose of assessing former Austrian imperial lands, Gibson was granted use of Emperor Franz Josef's private rail car by the new Austrian government. In Fiume, Trieste, and Zagreb, Gibson witnessed the clash between Italian, Yugoslav, and local authorities for control of the Isturian Peninsula. In Belgrade, he met with local humanitarian and industrial leaders, made notes for the Supreme Council in Paris, and gathered intelligence. Through all these adventures, coal was the central element which undergirded, but necessarily preceded, Hoover's plan for humanitarian aid. Before the war, Silesian coal powered industry and rail transportation for some 60 million people over a large swath of Central Europe. In January 1919, no one knew to which nation the coal fields belonged, but every nation coveted them. Conflict abounded, particularly in the rich Silesian industrial coal area between Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Coal magnates revved production while miners protested the increased workloads with no relief from wartime deprivations. Visiting Prague on several occasions that January, Gibson was party to numerous sensitive negotiations. Despite rumors that he would be named minister to Czechoslovakia once the U.S. created a legation there, Gibson kept the Polish perspective in mind. Warsaw itself, however, remained elusive. Last-minute orders always directed Gibson elsewhere. Returning to Paris in early February 1919, Gibson filed his reports. By mid-April, rumors of his assignment to Czechoslovakia proved false. Rather, President Wilson appointed him as the first U.S. minister to Poland in April. Gibson arrived in Warsaw just in time to witness the festivities for the first Polish Constitution Day in over a century, on May 3rd, with Pilsudski as president and Paderewski as prime minister. Determining borders and resolving the coal conflict in Silesia tested Gibson's diplomatic skill and patience. He, together with Anson Goodyear, helped to avert a new war, at least temporarily. Anson Goodyear, of the family known for tires and the blimp, joined the Army when the U.S. entered the war. After the armistice, Hoover chose Goodyear to head the coal mission, effectively putting him in charge of coal distribution in Austria, Hungary, and Poland, as well as the negotiations with Germany and Czechoslovakia. Goodyear cheerfully accepted Hoover's orders to do anything necessary to get the coal moving. Employing his native charm and his authority to provide or withhold food shipments, he calmed strikes and opened borders. Quote, anything necessary, end quote, is quite a story. On May 24, Goodyear arrived in Warsaw, oddly enough on the same train with Maurice Zamoyski, the Polish ambassador to France. Zamoyski was the owner of the Blue Palace in Warsaw, which he made available to the Americans rent-free. The ARA was headquartered there, and Gibson would set up his legation headquarters there in July. The meat of Goodyear's mission to Warsaw was addressed the next morning at a meeting with Polish and German officials to determine the distribution of coal from Katowice before it came into Polish possession. Unpleasantly surprised that the Poles proposed to cut off Germany entirely, Goodyear made it clear that this could not be allowed. The Poles, quote, saw the light at once, end quote. While these dramatic events unfolded in Poland, the Western world's attention was focused on Versailles. Gibson personally witnessed the formalities there on June 28, 1919. He journaled, quote, as Paderewski leaned over to sign, the sun came out and flooded the room with light, and the cannon began booming outside in the park. An airplane came swooping over the palace, and its hum filled the place. It was a good time to be superstitious. End quote. Meanwhile, back in Silesia, Goodyear struggled to get all parties to agree to a balanced distribution plan that the Supreme Council could approve by Hoover's target date of July 15. Things didn't work out quite as planned. Goodyear found, quote, everyone is boiling mad, labor is crazy, the military gents a tiptoe, business stagnant, and each little nationlet full of schemes to socialize everything, and credit is rotten, end quote. He was kept busy with endless crises long past July. For today's purpose, I'd like to focus on one particularly dramatic episode in which Goodyear, with Gibson's assistance plus a fair amount of bluff, brought about a positive outcome. Traveling with Hoover's party this time, Goodyear arrived back in Warsaw on August 11. Warsaw pulled out all the stops to shower Hoover with thanks. Goodyear had productive conversations with both Paderewski and Pilsudski and was reassured by the results, and went back to Vienna. However, on August 21st, quote, fate did another flip. A telegram arrived from Warsaw saying that the Germans had attacked and taken 2 Polish towns, and the Poles had retaliated in kind. It was decided that I must go to the trouble spot. I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to manufacture a little authority for myself. So I wrote telegrams to Warsaw and Berlin for Hoover to sign, stating that I represented the Commission for Upper Silesia and requesting that the military authorities of the 2 nations be directed by their governments to follow my directions as to the cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of troops. When I showed the telegrams to Hoover, he grinned and said, "It's all right if you can get away with it," and signed them. Incidentally, there wasn't any such commission. End quote. Back in Katowice again, Goodyear found that Polish insurgents retaliated by taking hundreds of German prisoners into Poland. A call to General Haller confirmed that the prisoners were in the custody of General Modlin, commander of Haller's 2nd Troops, and transferred to Krakow. Goodyear noticed, quote, "To my stupefaction, I found that the Polish government had actually instructed Haller and through him Modlin to follow my directions." End quote. Haller met Goodyear in Katowice on August 23, but still refused to speak to the German emissaries to discuss the release of the prisoners. Within moments, a German delegation threatened to execute 2 Poles for every German held if the Poles failed to comply immediately. Haller remarked pleasantly that, quote, "It looked like war." End quote. Goodyear quickly discovered that the delegation was not official, but rather sent by a much disliked German coal boss in Silesia, Otto Horsing, to intimidate the Poles into submission. It took some fancy talking to convince the young German envoys, but they finally acquiesced to the idea that government leaders on all sides would have to be consulted before beginning reprisals. Later that same day, Goodyear met with a contingent of German generals, led by Commander-in-Chief Wilhelm Groener. Groner was furious that his authority had been subverted by Horsing. At that point, Goodyear shrugged and said, quote, "Of course, I can do nothing more about the prisoners unless the ultimatum is withdrawn." End quote. Groner quickly withdrew the offensive ultimatum. It took plainer talking to gain Haller's acquiescence. Goodyear enlisted Gibson to activate the Polish government to increase pressure on Haller and announce the release of the hostages. Gibson warned that the Polish government was, quote, "under severe pressure to declare war," end quote. Almost 30,000 Polish refugees had already fled from Upper Silesia during the unrest and feared reprisals if they returned home. Goodyear convinced the German authorities to declare a general amnesty. By August 24th, he received word from Gibson that Haller had been directed to put the hostages at Goodyear's disposal. On August 25th, Goodyear was able to telegraph Hoover the good news that the German hostages had indeed been turned over to Goodyear and the Inter-Allied Commission. The Americans were pleased with this, quote, "additional evidence that the Polish government was doing everything in its power to avert hostility." On September 1st, Goodyear entrusted the safe return of 377 German hostages to Captain James Stader. About 120 of this number were German soldiers, the balance civilians. They were delivered to Upper Silesia the next day. The handoff went smoothly, with only a minor disturbance. Quoting Goodyear, a German lieutenant stopped Stader there, with a statement that he would fire on the Silesian pigs if they attempted to cross, whereupon Stader unfurled the American flag and marched across at their head. As he went on, just past the border patrol, he met a couple of German generals with 4 flat tires. He told them his story, and they drove him back to the border so that he could watch them pull the buttons and insignia off the lieutenant. After that, we practically owned Upper Silesia. We got all the information we wanted about anything. The miners were back at work. There was no more shooting in the streets at night. The party was over. Although Goodyear and Stader were the Americans on the front lines between the Germans and the Poles, Gibson's behind-the-scene role in Warsaw was also critical. Goodyear was quick to thank Gibson for his role in, quote, "inducing the Polish government to consent to the return of the hostages. I quite realize that without your influence it would have been impossible to bring this about, and it was most important that it be brought about." Later, in January 1921, Gibson wrote to Goodyear describing the then-current Polish situation. Quote, "As usual, we leap from one crisis to another. We are still as we were at the beginning of 19, just about to have a final settlement of Upper Silesia. Captain Stader still wanders in occasionally from Silesia to explain the situation. Probably 50 years from now, a feeble old gentleman with a long white beard, rejoicing in the same name, will continue to stagger in here and tell us about what dreadful things are going to happen in Silesia." End quote. Gibson wasn't far wrong. As history continued to unfold, the Silesian controversy kept resurging, eventually becoming one of the issues leading to the German invasion of Poland in 1919. There are hints of conflict yet today. So, were the contributions of Gibson and Goodyear all for nothing? Despite the reversals of history, I don't think so. The Polish-American connection, which developed in revolutionary times, had faded during the decades of Polish dismemberment. Gibson and Goodyear were instrumental in re-establishing the connection between the two nations that endures to this day, over 100 years later. May it always be so. Thank you.